Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Kelly Writers House live stream of Photofascism, Weaponizing Media in the 1930s and the Present. We have Vanessa Rocco here, and this is part of our Real Arts programming, an amazing series of programs curated, we'll say, by Anthony DeCurtis, who really connects our community with people doing interesting and exciting and important work in the arts. So I just want to take a second to thank Anthony for all of his work that he does there and to thank Vanessa for joining us. And I hope that you all enjoy the program.
Thank you, Al.
Yeah, Ali, thank you so much. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Vanessa, who's a dear friend and an extremely accomplished one. Uh, she is the co-editor of the New Woman International, Representations in Photography and Film from the 1870s through the 1960s, as well as the author of the book that brings us here today, Photofascism, Photography, Film, and Exhibition Culture in 1930s Germany and Italy. Um, in addition, Vanessa is an associate professor at Southern New Hampshire University and is formerly a curator at the International Center of Photography in New York City. Um, I have to say, um, the reason I invited uh, um, Vanessa was, I mean, fascism is a term that unfortunately we've, kind of grown used to using, very recently as, we witnessed a coup, attempted coup in DC. And um, I wanted, I mean, Vanessa is obviously really smart. Uh, and as I wanted to ground, some of the ideas that we're talking about in history. And, here comes Vanessa's new book, which is just terrific. And so, Vanessa will obviously say more about what she's going to do, but, I imagined it as a sort of like backdrop for, the issues that we're dealing with now. We didn't invent this. Um, although we're living with its consequences. So, my great pleasure, and I'm so much looking forward to this. Vanessa Rocco.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I am thrilled to have been introduced by Anthony, who I've known for many years now, and I've been a big fan of his writing for a long time as well. So I feel extra special to be introduced by him. So, and I think I'll start, if hopefully Anthony won't mind, because it's a fairly harmless anecdote. But when I was thinking out loud to him about how to frame this talk for this particular venue, he basically said, tell them about your book as if speaking with friends. And so I liked that. So I'm going to try that for the initial intro to why I wrote this book. And then I'll be moving on to showing you a lot of images and talking about them. And then hopefully at the end, we can have a conversation about a couple of additional images that I'll put up that are more recent. So initially, this will be historical, and then a couple images at the end that will get us a little bit more up to date. So I'll have the cover of the book up for a few minutes just while I tell you a little bit about how and why I wrote it. So I've been working on this book for a long time, and my last book came out in 2012, so it's been a while. And I think it's safe to say that when I initially started the project, that I mean, I'm a photo historian, and as with a lot of academic books, I would think I was really approaching it as an idea of filling up a hole that I saw in the history of early 20th century photography, especially how it was circulated and how it was received by the public. But then as the 2010s, you know, marched onward and autocracies began popping up at a more and more rapid pace globally, the project took on more of an urgency for me, because I felt very acutely that I was seeing in my own research, my archival research, precisely how these 1930s dictators harnessed mass media in order to create alternative realities. And the thing is, what we know is that it worked. They succeeded in persuading the public, their publics, to acquiesce, at least enough of them. And that acquiescence allowed for, Hitler, Mussolini, and others, but I'm focused on Germany and Italy, to wreak havoc across the globe. So I think that it's just very important to understand what happened as they were constructing these alternative realities for their publics, and then keep it in mind as we try to sort of sift through the way new media platforms are constructing their own versions of alternative realities. Okay, so I'll get more specific now. It's the ultimate case study. That's kind of my argument in the creation of alternative mass media realities and the consequences of them. So first, though, I'm going to start with Mussolini. Mussolini was the pioneering mass media dictator, and he became a template for Hitler. He was in power over a decade before Hitler rose in 1933. So Mussolini came to power in 1922. And he was an aggrieved World War I veteran and a notoriously charismatic speaker, and came from the working class. And he became a kind of ideal figure for other aggrieved, particularly war veterans, to coalesce around. And so when he came to power in 1922, one thing that became very apparent, now this is just so that as a reference point, this is the cover of the exhibition catalog that I'll be referring to, the exhibition I'll be referring to most often when it comes to the Italians, and I'll be nicknaming it MRF instead of burdening you with the Italian. Okay, this translates into exhibition of the fascist revolution. But you can see that, he has the cover of the exhibition catalog very dramatically pronouncing what this show is about. Duce was what he was called, kind of his nickname, leader. Duce. So Mussolini loved to use mass media, and he was a master of it. And one of the things that's sort of important to keep in mind is that this period between the two wars, so basically the 20s, roughly the 20s and 30s, this is the first generation that is really getting a majority of their information through images. So there's an explosion during this period of weekly illustrated magazines, for example. So for the first time, people were actively consuming information through these lavish, large spread magazines. Just as one example, there were 9 weekly illustrated magazines in Berlin alone. So this really was a kind of explosion. So Mussolini, he was also a master of the rally. And so the large scale rallies that he staged were then, what he understood about these rallies was that if he was able to use these kind of vehicles of mass media, he could reach vastly larger numbers of audiences than through rallies alone, right? So he has these these spectacles, rallies where he would make sure and place himself in some sort of an area where you could see clearly architecture, historical architecture that would call up, for example, the golden era of Rome, either ancient or Renaissance, and it would harness the or sort of anchor the spaces, and so you get a combination of these oceanic mobs or crowds rather. So this is from an essay, a great essay called Mob Form in a book called Crowds, all gathering to hear him. But then it's also very kind of self-consciously staged for the weekly illustrated magazines that are going to be circulated around to millions of additional people. So you have the rally, and then you have the representation of the rally, and they work in tandem with each other. Now, what Mussolini also realized was that he could use he saw the effectiveness of using photographic production in these weekly illustrated magazines. And he also realized that he could utilize, photography in these kind of mass spectacles. Exhibitions have become very popular locations for people to get information as well through photographic production. So on the 10th anniversary of his rise to power, 1932, they put the Fascist Party puts on this exhibition, the MRF, and it's essentially a way for him to tell the story of his successes the way that he wants to tell it. It's organized chronologically in this very large space that still is actually standing in Rome, the Palazzo d'Esposizione. And so it starts in 1914, and then it makes a full circle to 1922 when he rises to power. So this is actually him being given a tour through the space. And what is interesting about this, so this is him over here. It allows you to see the massive scale of these constructions. But what I also like about an image like this is that it gives you a sense of how the photographs are interspersed with sculptural elements. And there's a lot of writing in, so essentially the photography becomes like architecture. So there's some very interesting passages in the exhibition catalog where you can see the organizers talking specifically about how, in their opinion, if the photographs are fitted into kind of large-scale sculptural spaces, they will work in dramatic fashion on the visitor's mind. So it's documentary material, but it is sculpted in such a way that the fascists can articulate the story they want to articulate, and it will actually work on the visitors' minds. So they were very aware of the power of photography, and also the fact that people had a kind of relationship with photography at this time, equating it with truth, with fact. Probably more so than, I think we're a little more skeptical of that now, but it was a very kind of pronounced assumption at this time that photography was equated with truth. So as you move around the space chronologically, so this is room A, this is about World War I. Then you move around the space, you come to room G, so it's alphabetical order. I'm just giving you a little snapshot of a couple rooms before we get to the really grand room. Here you see this use of photography and mass media to actually compose the figures. In this case, this is the room that is dedicated to his fascist combatants. So these were the thugs essentially that were supporting him in the late teens after the war, that helped support him as he consolidated power. So essentially photography creating these humanoid figures. Then you get to the kind of the sort of climax of the exhibition space. And this is where you can see the idea of fusing together photography, architecture, sculpture, and then also sloganeering in order to, create this kind of all-encompassing space for the visitors. And this is also a good place for me to mention, I don't want to forget this, the scale of the visitation to the show. It was up for 2 years, and they calculated that approximately 4 million Italians visited during that period. So we're talking about 10% of the entire Italian population. So you would have to compare the impact of this exhibition to something that would attract 35 million people here in the United States. So this is significant experience, collective experience that people are having. So they're coming into this room. And again, these vitrines over here give you a sense of like, this would be human scale, right? So the visitor is being bombarded by kind of a combination of documentary images fitted into sculptural, constructions. And they include his favorite kind of rally scenes here. This is a photo blow up. Okay, so these photo blow ups are plastered all over the space. And so you get the kind of the rally, the presentation of the rally. You get these crisscrosses that are hovering above your head. These are covered with flags of the enemies of the fascist party, including socialists and anarchists, with daggers, slicing through them. So the theatricality here is very pronounced. And then as you continue walking through the space, you can sort of see here, you're getting other kinds of constructions. These are more of these oceanic crowd scenes that he loved so much to reproduce in those weekly illustrated magazines. Here, they're plastered onto the on these airplane turbines. So there's a kind of implication here of violence in effect, and the collective hands that are hovering over a letter that is written in Mussolini's hand, where he is quoting an Italian poet talking about the need to sacrifice blood for the soil. So he's essentially priming the audience to get ready to sacrifice themselves for the purposes of the state. And then as you continue walking through the space, I'm sort of taking you on a trip, which you can see through this is the end point of the cross with the daggers. I also think it's interesting to notice that he makes a point of having the architects and designers use very industrialized looking materials, like this hammered steel. So it's very important for these fascist dictators to concurrently call up the good old days for people, appeal to their nostalgia, like with the Roman architecture, combined with the crowd scenes. But then in addition to that, make sure that it looks like progress is being made. We're going forward into the future. So we're kind of regaining our past glories, but we're still also modern and industrial and new. And this was also something that this was a combination that Hitler also used in a lot of his imagery. There's a historian named Jeffrey Herf who refers to this as reactionary modernism. So as you exit from this kind of this insane theatricality of Room O, you then come into the March on Rome. And this was was a kind of rewriting of history that Mussolini does, where he makes it look like he came to power through conquest, when in fact, he really came to power through a negotiated settlement, a political negotiated settlement with the king. So he's in effect, as people come out, they come to this much more simplified photo montage showing a march on Rome with the implication that this was his final conquest and that he came to power in a more militaristic way than he really did. So the rewriting of history there. And then, so, you know, guess who went to see that exhibition in 1933? Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and he was a fan of the Italian exhibition. And actually, I have an interesting quote from his diaries. I'm just going to read to you real quick. Italian fascism is modern and has close ties with the people. We should learn from it. That's his diary entry from June 1933. So I think these large-scale photo montages in particular showed Goebbels how you could, you know, create these spaces that could immerse people, the visitors to these exhibitions, in the sort of sensation of being part of rallies, for example, even if they could not attend the rallies, right? So this is, again, a way to see how these fascist regimes created echo chambers, deep and substantive echo chambers. The rallies take place, the attendees to the rallies are riled up, but the rallies are concurrently being staged for photographers like Heinrich Hoffmann, who was the photographer of most of these rally shots that were blown up for the space. And then the rallies are also being staged for the filmmakers like Leni Riefenstahl. So Riefenstahl is creating her famous Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Will, documenting a rally in Nuremberg in 1934. So what it looks like is that she is a documentarian who is recording a rally that's taking place on the ground. Now it was a few days of events. So there were more raucous rallies, and then there were parades like this one. And then there were also meetings of youth organizations that were documented. But what's actually happening is that these rallies that look spontaneous are being staged for Riefenstahl. You know, hundreds and hundreds of cameras were staged around Nuremberg so that she could get every kind of shot and then piece it together into a film that millions of additional people would see. So you have the ability to reach thousands of people in rallies, then you have the ability to reach millions of people who can be made to feel like they attended the rally. And it sort of creates this this echo chamber. You've got the photographic spaces, you've got the filmic experiences, and then you have the people who are actually going to the rallies, and they self-reinforce each other, which I think is creates. This is something we can do in the discussion section, but creates a very interesting comparison to now and the kind of self-reinforcing that happens between a rally and then the reproduction of the rally for cable news networks, and then the appropriation of those rallies for social media platforms. And they're reinforcing each other, because of course you can only get, you know, maybe 10,000 people at a rally, but you can get 3 million people tuning into said rally on Fox News in the evening. Now, I do want to just give like a little bit of a mention that Mussolini also used propagandistic film in his circulation of media. But you know, it wasn't on the level of spectacle that Riefenstahl really reached for Hitler. Mussolini was more focused on short films. They were sort of like newsreel films that would be shown before, you know, Italian features, for example, in cinemas. But he did found an institute called Luce, and their job was to produce these films that had to be seen before before feature films in Italian cinemas. It was a requirement. And he made a point in a lot of them. This is a really interesting one that I reproduce in the book. This is a screenshot, a still, not a still, a piece of celluloid from the actual film, where he is threshing wheat with the workers. He's actually got his glasses on, and he's making himself look very much like he's one of the workers. He's one of the working people, sort of going back to his working class roots. Okay, so then now let me just kind of remind you of the chronology here. So we've got this first exhibition that the Germans mounted. This is the one that was influenced directly by the Italian exhibition. But this was mounted in November of 1933. The Nazis came to power in January. That means that they had to start working on this exhibition almost the moment that they came into power. So it was clearly a very important priority for them to put together these jumbo exhibitions, and they continued to do so throughout the 30s. So Triumph of the Will is 1935, based on a 34 film. And then this exhibition, Deutschland, in 1936, it gives you a sense of how the aggrandizement of Hitler himself becomes more and more pronounced. In Decamera, you have more of a sense of the sort of the masses at the rallies. Here you have these kind of mass photographs that Mussolini also used a lot, but he is, you know, clearly being emphasized over the workers and the soldiers. And again, just to give you a sense of spectacle here, how all encompassing these spaces were for the visitors. This is the door. This is the little doorway down here. I'm hoping that everybody can see my pointer, by the way. And this is a strange looking photo, I know, but I took this at the last second from my book because I find this a fascinating image from the Deutschland exhibition. This is a room that is filled with text panels, and the images are, I mean, the text panels are all related to all of the challenges that the Nazis had to overcome in order to rise to their rightful place in power. So it's almost like a grievance-filled room of what the communists were doing to us and what, you know, the socialists were doing to us, and how we had to overcome. So I find the sort of grievance theme very interesting here, but also one of the things I find interesting about this particular room, and it might be something to talk about in discussion, is the idea of words becoming image. So this is almost purely textual, but the texts are the image. And I think it's an interesting question to sort of tease out. I'm working on a research project right now that's related to this, about whether or not texts can rise to the level of image and actually become an image in and of itself, sort of like the chyrons that you see floating across cable news networks if you have the volume down. And so I just think it's a kind of an interesting idea, the idea of word as image. Can it be as persuasive? I'm not sure yet. And then 1 year later, 1937, give me 4 years time. This is a kind of apotheosis of Nazi photographic exhibition spectacle. These are the opening ceremonies, and just to sort of give you a sense of how they're trying to, you know, reach this kind of, you know, all encompassing sensory stimulation. You have this, you know, kind of almost like light show happening around the eagle. You have these enormous, and again, these are human figures, so you can see the scale here. You have these enormous photographic panels that are actually moving mechanically as storybooks. So they're opening one after the other in a mechanized fashion in order to tell the story of economic resurgence under Hitler. So he's essentially celebrating the fact that in 4 years, he has brought the economy back from the devastation of the Depression era. And then I had to give you a sense of the kind of massive scale that people are confronting when they're walking into these spaces. And I mean, it's important to remember that technology is, you know, this is a moment where technology is meeting the moment. The ability to make these enormous photo blowups was recent. And so, you know, this is allowing for the massive scale of these photo blowups. And then here you can see these human figures, just to give you a sense of just how large this is. You know, this is the size of this has been compared to the Brazilian statue of the Madonna in the mountains. It's that large. And you know, again, these exhibitions are being attended by massive numbers of people who are being encompassed into these worlds. All right, let me just check on. Oh, good. I think we're good with time here. All right, so these alternative realities allow me to maybe create a segue to the current. Now, I want to be careful about this because I don't want to you know, present myself as someone who's going to make a direct analogy between the dictators of the 30s and Trump. Although you know, there's been some very interesting work recently about creating a lineage between the you know, the 30s dictators and Trump, in particular Strongmen by Ruth Ben-Ghiat that came out last year. But what I do think that my my project and people who work like me who work in visual culture need to take on is the importance, the central role that images have played in the rise of autocracies currently. And I think that it's safe to say that the analysis, a visual analysis that's taking place has not been sufficient in dealing with the way images have been leveraged by people like Trump. Just case in point would be this film, the movie At the Ellipse, as it's called, that was shown. It was a 2-minute film. It was shown on January 6th at the rally. It was screened right after Giuliani's speech, but before Trump's. And, you know, the film is filled with kind of, you know, Riefenstahl-esque tropes of rallies being shown in the film to the ralliers. So you get this kind of echo chamber. And you know, low-angled shots of Trump that you know, that heroicize him, aggrandize him, very much a technique that Riefenstahl used when she was filming Hitler, and also, like, you know, sort of little nods to planes, trains, and automobiles, which, you know, Hitler would always make a point of doing. This exhibition, Give Me 4 Years' Time, had like a mini model of the Autobahn running through the show, so that again, people could both feel like Germany was recouping its grand past, but also moving forward into the present. And the film also, this Trump film also contained images, close-ups of women crying, weeping. And this is just a film that I feel like was not really analyzed sufficiently in mainstream media. The speeches that took place at this rally were much more, I think, parsed as to how they riled up the crowd. But what about this film? You know, the purpose of this film was really to rile up the crowd. So Zach and I decided not to show film clips because the audio can be a little bit wonky, but it would be something I'm interested in discussing in the discussion section that's about to start in a minute. How many people feel like they've actually seen the film, and you know, was this sufficiently discussed? I mean, this is different than the film that was put together for the impeachment trial. This was a 2-minute film that was actually shown to the ralliers, and I think needs to be closely parsed. And then apart from Trump, I also just want to kind of re-emphasize the importance that I think that exists in people engaged in visual culture, like me, really being part of the conversation of propaganda that is circulating more and more. There's been a spike actually in right-wing propaganda, no surprise, in 2020 that's just been charted and documented by the ADL and the AP. And the question is, how are we going to make sure that people understand what it is about these images that are grabbing them and and appealing to them viscerally? And it's not just about the message, it's also about the image itself. And I think that that's one of the really important things about the book, even my book, even comparing an image like this is one of the posters that was circulated around to try to get people to protest on the 17th on right-wing media. You can see historical elements being used here, including color schemes, diagonals, and aggressive typography. But I'm not seeing enough of a conversation out there about the visual qualities. And so I think it's important, but I also welcome pushback or debate if others think that these things are being critically analyzed sufficiently. So let's talk about that. Now that it's almost 5:45.
Well, that was great. And let's discuss it. We have some questions here. Rachel Dennis has asked one. It says, was Triumph of the Will also intended to reach a new audience?
A new audience that had not yet been converted to Nazism.
That the question is as written, but let's answer it the way you think it ought to be answered.
Well, I mean, I think that it's an interesting question. If you could come at it from two different directions. One would be, was it intended to reach a youthful audience, an up and coming generation? Then yes, definitely. There's it's made up of several sequences, and one of the sequences is based in a youth camp, so that the audience seeing Triumph of the Will can see that the youth has been fully encompassed into the ideology, but also so that youth can see themselves, this echo chamber idea, can see themselves in the theater. So new audiences as far as youth, yes. People who the Nazis are still trying to reach and convert, I would think so. I mean, it's a good question, because one of the things that has to be remembered about the earlier part of the 1930s is that Goebbels very much wanted to encourage consent and acquiescence into the Nazi Party. He didn't start with coercion or violent coercion. The idea was to try to get buy-in from as many people as possible. It's another quote that I have around the same place where I have the Italian quote, which is, this is from a speech Goebbels gave in 1933: "Work on people until they accept our influence." So there's a desire for consent. And then it's later in the 30s where coercion and violence start to be used more. But initially, the Nazis are trying to meet people where they are, or encompass them into their vision of greatness. So yeah, I think that it was a multi-pronged reach out, triumph of the will.
We have a question from Husna Hashim, who asks, how do you think the scale of an exhibition affects or affected its function as propaganda?
I think it's enormously important to think about the impact. Let's go back to the Italians. I mean, I've talked a lot about scale with these, gigantic blowups, but I really like, when it comes to scale, I like to think about what it was actually like physically for people to walk into a space like this. I mean, there's a combination in this exhibition, room by room, going on with rooms that are smaller scale, more relatable, kind of human to human relationships being, created. And then you walk in to a space like this, and the purpose is to overwhelm. So they establish relationships with all of these spectators that are coming in, these visitors that are coming in, that are more kind of relatable, and people feel enfranchised in a lot of these spaces, because one of the things that the fascists did was they made a big deal out of calling out for submissions to the show. So if you have things from the war, pamphlets, draft posters, this room was filled with draft posters, so call outs for troops. If you have those things, you send them to us and we will put them in the show, because this show is for you. That's the implication. But of course, the show was not for them. The show, it was a kind of a ruse for enfranchising people. And so that, they very cleverly construct an experience that can feel relatable, and then boom, you walk in here and you're, overwhelmed by the theatricality of what you've become involved in. So I think, I think that the relationship of scale within these spaces is enormously important. They have to also figure out how to appeal to different audiences. There's differentiation going on in these spaces. They want to appeal to, let's say, the base, very kind of riled up base that Mussolini already had when he came into power. But they also want to try to convert the middle class, who were extremely paranoid about the potential for the socialists or the communists to take over the government. And so that's where all of this kind of, heavy duty anti-socialist propaganda comes in. That's more of an appeal to the middle class. So they're figuring out how to get that consent And part of the ways they're doing that is through scale.
Well,
very
the
touching.
sense of, if I may, are you done?
Oh yeah.
The sense of scale, it seems to me also, you know, and grandeur, you know, the grandeur of ancient Rome, you know, the grandeur of the homeland, of Deutschland. You know, it's like also it encourages you to think of yourself as part of something larger than yourself. You know, that it's directed to you, but it also elevates you into this, you know, into this whole, so that there is an identification that's formed by the scale. Like if it, you know, this is what it means. This is what we get when we believe this.
Yeah.
We don't stay human scale. We stay, you know, we're larger than that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's so exactly if you look at something like this, you know, this is clearly intended to make people both concurrently feel excited about being part of something larger than themselves. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of you know, individual humans squeezed into these photographs that are plastered on these turbines. But it's, you know, it's concurrently and you see these hands again hovering over. You have to imagine, you know, you're down here looking up at these turbines, looking up at these hands hovering over you. And then you're also seeing the writing over here about, like, you know, in Mussolini's hand, get ready to sacrifice yourself for the state. So you're part of something grand, large, historical, because you're, you know, you're Italian. And then, you know, guess what? You get ready to sacrifice yourself for it. So it's how they, you know, it's how they get people, prime people to sacrifice themselves for the state.
We have another question from Rachel Dennis, who asks, um, how would movie At the Ellipse compare to Triumph of the Will in terms of reception, size, audience, and purpose?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. The I don't know if people are familiar, how many people are familiar with the writings of the philosopher Jason Stanley, but he's published, you know, recently a very important book on what makes fascism fascism, and he wrote a whole analysis of the movie At the Ellipse. That's where the link will take you. This link will take you to Stanley's article, and he does a kind of piece by piece analysis of how the film gets people ready to take action. Essentially, that this film is a key component of what primed people on the 6th to amp them up and get ready to go storm the Capitol, because of the way that Trump's people put this together and speaks directly to the threat, the other, to the United States. So there's little clips of Hollywood. There's anti-Semitic overtones when they showed Chuck Schumer, all of this, the Black Lives Matter, the threats, and then it's about Trump heroicized through angle shots and, you know, people weeping as he walks by. He is going to save you, but you have to help him. And so there's, you know, there's direct relationships between the anti-Semitism, who's going to save you, you have to do something about it, all in this 2-minute clip, versus Triumph of the Will, which was hours long film.
Now, and was movie At the Ellipse made exclusively to be shown at that rally? Like, was it circulated elsewhere, or?
Yeah, no, I think that from what I understand, it was created to be shown at the rally. And Trump apparently became very involved towards the end of the planning as to what the lineup would be. which means now they haven't been able to completely ascertain that he decided that this film should be shown right after Giuliani spoke. But Giuliani speaks, talks about, uses the specific language of combat.
Yes.
And then he walks off the stage and this film goes up. And, you can see this kind of, the repetition also of the film on these jumbo screens, which wasn't really even necessary because, you can see the audience can see the one jumbo screen, but there's this repetition of his face, of the music, and of these most importantly dominated by rally goers. So the rally goers are seeing themselves up on the screen. They themselves are also being aggrandized along with Trump. So they become part of his project. So, yeah.
We have another question here from Feral Dove, who asks, do you notice any of these visuals being utilized in corporate media content? Some images in recent superhero movies come to mind.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm sorry, what's the name?
Feral Dove?
Would Feral be willing to give me like one specific example from a superhero movie that comes to mind?
I don't know.
Okay.
Evidently not. But
so fascistic imagery being incorporated into more corporate productions. And when you say corporate, we're talking not businesses, but we're talking about corporate Hollywood production. I'm not sure. I'd have to.
I think you should just interpret it, as you like, or as you, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might have to chew on that one a little bit. I mean, I guess I know what you're saying when it comes to kind of the extreme dynamism that's used and a lot of sort of low angled shots to heroicize, in the superhero movies. But I'm not sure that I would equate it directly with fascistic imagery. I'd have to mull that one over.
What about in advertising?
Yeah, well, so advertising is an interesting example because let me go back to something like this. So when the 1920s avant-garde artists were actually, when they were really developing some of the most dynamic techniques for images of persuasion, but they were doing it from the left. They were doing it in more of a kind of a socialistic context, which was, we want to reach the masses to educate them, for example, or, to help empower them in the workplace. So this was the more idealistic 1920s socialist avant-garde. They were very much looking at the language of advertising because they wanted to persuade. And so when you're trying to sell a product, you have to figure out how to use images to grab people's eyeballs, right? So there definitely was a relationship in the 1920s, between artists who considered themselves very progressive and avant-garde and the language of advertising. They were ironically feeding off each other, because they were trying to figure out how to use things like what you're seeing here, diagonal lines, typography that was aggressively interesting, and also really interesting experiments in combining design elements with photographic elements, because the artist believed that if you plopped in a photo in there, it would have a more visceral appeal to a larger audience because it looked more real. Again, in the 20s, there's this kind of assumed truth value to photography. If it's a photograph, it's got to be real. And so that was used to benefit advertisers, but it was also certainly used to benefit the fascists, because they knew that if people walked into these spaces again, I'm going to go back to the Italians, but they walk into these spaces and they see what looks like documentary, especially anonymous documentary photography. It has the veneer of absolute truth to it, but what the fascists are doing is they're taking advantage of that in order to fit all of this documentary material into shapes and forms that convey the message they want it to convey. So in fact, it becomes the opposite of what we assume documentary to be. So there's very, very interesting relationships there.
We have a question from Amanda Bogoslavsky, who says, I see these types of larger than yourself imagery in advertisements for Nike and other athletic brands to motivate people. My question is that if you would agree that these are similar.
So you feel like you're seeing images that are similar. So yeah, see, I can't have this back and forth with them, but I'm wondering if she's referring to something more like this kind of thing. In which case, yes. Again, I don't think that I would equate it directly with fascistic imagery, but what I would equate it with are images of persuasion. And that's where things get really tricky, because I think we have a tendency now to define propaganda as negative, right? Propaganda is the use of persuasive images in order to force people to, into restrictive political regimes. But in the earlier part of the 20th century, like in the 20s and 30s, propaganda was a word that was used both by the left and the right. It was equated with persuasion, with persuasive images, whether that be for the benefit of the individual, or which was the feeling, at least, of the socialists, or for the idea of encompassing that individual into the state, like the fascists. So yes, I think in advertising you're always going to see elements of images of persuasion. When it comes to the fascist version of images of persuasion, of course, it's generally about one. It's made to look like it's about one person, and then, of course, what's not said is that there's a whole bureaucracy backing up that one person, but it's in the, it's for the benefit of one person as opposed to the corporation with advertisements. So you have to sort of distinguish, I think, ads from fascism.
We do have Feral Dove has followed up here for an example from the movies. Batman in The Dark Knight or the Nolan franchise as examples.
Oh, okay, of fascistic imagery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, part of the kind of story of The Dark Knight is somewhat fascistic. So yes, I can see it. I'm not sure if on a technical level, I don't know about a technical level. I'd say maybe more the narrative could be compelling. So usually I sort of distinguish between form and content. But I think I see what you're getting at when it comes to the narrative. And by the way, if I could, I don't want to discount what people are saying about the relationships between capitalism and fascism. I mean, there's been some very, very interesting work about the kind of confluence of capitalism and fascism in Germany under Hitler. But when it comes to the imagery of advertising and the imagery of fascist regimes, I do think that certain distinctions have to be made because of fascism's dependence on the cult of personality of the leader.
Well, Lavina Charles asks, or comments. I think of Amazon's commercials about how they can help feed people because of how entrenched they are in the community. Gives me a "we alone can save you" vibe.
Sorry about that. Let me just go back to my phone.
Did you?
We alone can save you.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yes. I know what you mean. I mean, yes, I think that is a very good example of the idea of the leader. Okay, here's Duce. So clearly he is presenting himself this Trumpian idea of "I alone can fix it."
yeah,
Mussolini consistently presents himself as that. In this room, for example, one of the things you can't see in this particular installation shot that I chose is that there's an enormous metal profile of Mussolini that hovers over here. So he hovers over everything. So yeah, the fascist leaders definitely present Hitler and Mussolini. I alone can fix it. I'm the one who saved you from socialism. That's what Mussolini is saying in this room. This reference right here, over here, this is translated from Italian, is legal strikes. Italy was racked by workers striking in the period before Mussolini took over. So this big spider web over here is referencing how the socialists striking, the workers, striking, were tangling up the entire economy till I came along and I saved it.
well, I remember when I was a kid, you know, in an Italian community, in New York, and, people would say,
The
you know,
train's on time.
Mussolini made the trains run on time, as if, and I thought it was, like, always such a, I mean, I get it about how disorganized Italy can seem, but also, the sense that he was affecting every single thing, you know, like he wasn't too big to be concerned with the trains running on.
Oh, sure. Actually, thank you for saying that so that we can go back to the threshing of the wheat here.
Yeah,
I mean, his identification as coming from a working class background was very important to his cult of personality. His father was a blacksmith. So, I come from working people. But what's so interesting about this film, for example, this film about threshing wheat. So if you watch the whole film, and you can go to the site of the Istituto Luce, and you can watch all of these films, and it's fascinating. But he comes to the wheat field in a big black car. He gets out of his limo, then he gets into the wheat field, threshes the wheat with all the working people, takes his shirt off at one point, and then gets back in the car, in the big black car, and drives away. So it's almost like people want, they want both. They
yeah,
want this idea that he is of the working class like them, but they also want the glamour
yes.
of, the dream of wealth. I mean, I don't know if that's part of Trump's appeal as well, this, idea that somehow he's one of us, but he drives a limo, or he's in a limo and he's in like a private plane. It's a really interesting dynamic.
Well, just thank you for being so patient with all this. But I will ask one final question,
Okay, great.
which is, I mean, so in your view, like, is there a fascist aesthetic? I mean, are these techniques, or I mean, are there specific techniques that work exclusively toward the ends of fascism, or are these things, could they be applied, by so-called progressives or
Oh my God, it's such a good
whatever?
question. Because one of the reasons why it's such a good question is that the fascists took these techniques directly from the left, and then, like, perverted a lot of the same techniques that the left had developed. I mean, in my book, actually, the first chapter is about this kind of last gasp progressive show about labor unions in Germany. It's 1931. So it was not a foregone conclusion that Germany would become fascist in 1931, right? I mean, the socialist left was very much, and the social democrats were in power, so the center left were in power, but they, it was an alliance of the center and the left, and so labor unions were much celebrated, and the techniques that they developed included like the use of these huge photo blowups, but of workers and kind of anonymous workers. And
Yeah.
so it was a way of celebrating the workers.
Yeah.
And then, then a couple years later, Goebbels sees that, and Goebbels is using that same idea of the photo blow up to instead aggrandize the dictator. So modernism and fascism are often looked upon as these diametric opposites, but the fascists were looking at what the progressive left was doing with their visual culture, and they grabbed that and then they used it for their own odious purposes. So it's what's so slippery about it, and which is why your question is so good, is that it ends up being about intent in a lot of cases, and you have to, and discerning that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
For people to go through these exhibitions and absorb these and be bombarded with these messages was extremely challenging, and it continues to be extremely challenging in the environment that we all find ourselves in now, because we have to figure out how to parse all the stuff online.
Well, it's work. I mean, as you say, I mean, that work is work that probably we'll all be having to do for some time to come. But this was enlightening and just so well done. Vanessa Rocco is the author of Photofascism, Photography, Film, and Exhibition Culture in the 1930s Germany and Italy. And thank you for joining us. I only wish it could have been in person, Vanessa.
I know. I really do miss being in the space with everybody, but hopefully someday very soon. Right. And I really appreciate all the great questions, especially about this, about capitalism, and I mean, there's just a lot of really rich issues when it comes to visual culture and images of persuasion. So let's all keep doing this work together.
Great. Once again, Vanessa Rocco, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. Okay. Bye-bye.